Let's get a songbook and turn to number 714. 714. If I'm going to sing this song, I'll ask John if you would lead us in opening prayer. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet, we will sit at His feet, or will walk by His side in the rain. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey.
Good evening, everybody. Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20. Appreciate your being here with us tonight and being a part of our midweek Bible study class. And later we'll have a devotional. Kids are having classes downstairs, and we're glad that you're here for the adult class. We will be having an auditorium class here in our Vacation Bible School. We'll have different speakers Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights. And then on Friday night, the awards will be handed out and all of that. And I think there's a little bit more food planned for that night. Matthew chapter 20, we got down to verses 20 through 28. So that's where we want to study tonight. The preceding section had to do with Jesus announcing that they would be going up to Jerusalem, and there He would be met with resistance and eventually betrayed and be condemned to death and would be mocked and scourged by the Gentiles and eventually, of course, be crucified. But on the third day He would rise again. Immediately following that particular section and those, well, I guess you could say events that would shake up the disciples, we read that they returned to the problem of bickering about who was the greater among them. And let's look at verses 20 through 28 in our study tonight. Let's read it together first. Then came to Him the mother of Zebedee's children with her sons, worshiping Him and desiring a certain thing of Him. And He said unto her, What wilt thou? She saith unto Him, Grant that these my two sons may sit, the one on thy right hand and the other on the left, in thy kingdom. But Jesus answered and said, you know not what you ask. Are you able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of, and to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they say unto him, We are able. And he said unto them, You shall drink indeed of my cup, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them from whom it, or for whom it is prepared of my Father. And when the 10 heard it, they were moved with indignation against the two brethren. And Jesus called them unto him and said, You know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. When you first look at that section, you cannot help but wonder how it could be that after all the teaching Jesus has done and all the instruction he's imparted to these 12 men, that they cannot understand what greatness is all about. This discussion has taken place before, and this same subject has been raised several times already in the book of Matthew about who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom. But it still hasn't sunk in, as we used to say. They still do not have a grasp on the nature of the kingdom and what it will take to be successful as a servant in it. In fact, it seems that they have no concept of service because they're thinking about positions of rank and authority instead of thinking of their work or following of Jesus being an act of service to others, primarily to God, and then secondarily, of course, to all people. Being a servant. Let's look at the players in this story. We'll put that in quotation marks. Notice that the first person is the mother of Zebedee's children. Now, there used to be an old joke that would be asked, and sometimes people would who were teaching kids would ask them, who was the father of Zebedee's children? And they would say, and it'd take a minute for them to figure out who the father of Zebedee's children was. But here you have Zebedee as the father, but the mother is not mentioned by name here. She is alluded to. We'll find out a little bit more about her. As you can find out in Matthew 27, about verse 26, I believe it is, or 56 rather. Her name is Salome, Salome. And Mark 15:40 also mentions her by name. It may be that she was Mary's sister. When you study Matthew 27 and Mark 15 along with John 19:25, you're led to that conclusion. That would mean that these two boys of hers were first cousins to Jesus. And they would have been related in that way. And so she would have been the aunt of Jesus. And how many of you in here is an aunt? Aha, several. I'm glad no men raised their hands. Aunts sort of, they have a thing with nieces and nephews. They're usually very protective of them. They really take up for them. You can ask Andrew about that. My sister, boy, she'll take up for Andrew real quickly, because he would go over and stay with her when Amanda was doing some things in Murfreesboro, and he would just sort of say, Mama, it's time for you to leave, you know, because Aunt Joyce would let him do just about anything he wanted. He always got to do exactly what he wanted. I mean, she would ask him, you know, "Now, when you come, what do you want?" And pretty well received it. And if I remember correctly, Susan's sister, Aunt Margaret, was pretty much that way about Johnny and Susan's children too. And I think that's just as it should be. I had a lot of aunts growing up, and uncles too, that were really good to me, and you know, they'd take up for me and give somebody a thrashing, I guess, if they had bothered me. But being that type of a relationship, you would think that she would come to Jesus and ask him a favor. You know, I'd like to ask you a favor. And I don't think that she really instigated that. I think the boys had that desire, and she came on their behalf. We'll say more about that maybe in a minute. But as you read about this woman, she was, number one, a follower of Jesus. She was present at his crucifixion. She was a part of the burial and going to the tomb. And of course, she knew about his resurrection because she went to the tomb. So Salome is a very important figure in that connection. And then we have her two sons. These would be James and John. It's usually thought that James was the older because he is always mentioned first. Peter, James, and John. And they were very, very important in the early work of the church. They're called the sons of Zebedee. They were fishermen by trade. We know that by going back to the accounts in Matthew 4 that we studied many weeks ago, where Jesus, walking by the sea, called Peter and Andrew and James and John. And it is said specifically that James and John left their father. He was there with them. They were mending nets. And they left their dad and the fishing business and became followers of Christ. But Mark doesn't mention the wife of Zebedee in his account in Mark chapter 4. Or rather in Mark chapter 10. He just simply has James and John making the request. And that's the reason I said a moment ago that I don't think that she necessarily instigated this. That they no doubt had talked with her and so on, and she went ahead and made this request on their behalf. Matthew has all three coming and making the request, as we've seen in our reading tonight. So the mother, sort of took the lead and said, I will ask him if that can be arranged. And then the third group that we have are the other disciples. There would be 10 others. Judas hasn't left yet. And so there would be 10 of them. And we're told that they became very agitated. The King James, or the New King James says they were greatly displeased. The New American Standard says they were indignant. Now that means that they were really upset. They were very upset. They overheard the conversation. Sometimes we can think that we're talking privately only to find out that people have been listening. And so they sort of caught on to what was going on, and they let it be known that they did not appreciate this. Now, do you think it was a righteous anger? Were they angry because they thought that these two men should have known better and that none of the disciples would would desire to want to be ranked above anybody else? I don't think so. They would probably had some selfish ambitions of their own. And I don't know who would have taken the lead and objecting to what these two men were asking for, but there's a lot of difference in having righteous indignation and having selfish ambition. There's a lot of difference in those two things. Sometimes people object because they're envious or they're jealous. And other times people object to something because they are genuinely aroused to righteous indignation. They realize that it's wrong. And so that's the difference that we need to always have. Recall, if you will, the previous discussion about this particular subject, about who would be greatest in the kingdom. This discussion had taken place as they traveled from Caesarea Philippi towards Capernaum back in Acts 18. And they began discussing among themselves who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. When Jesus asked them, in Mark's account anyway, what they were discussing, they were too embarrassed to tell him. Most of us have been caught in something like that, you know. We're just talking and we're really quite stirred up about something, and then somebody asks us, you know, what's going on. Now imagine if Jesus were to ask us. He already knew what they were talking about, and it sort of embarrassed them. But that discussion ended with the Last Supper is going to take place there in the book of Mark and Luke. And they're still debating the matter, according to Luke 22, as they prepare for that Last Supper. Think about this event that's coming up, and they have really no concept of what is about to happen, even though Jesus has tried to prepare them for it and told them what's going to befall him when he gets to Jerusalem. And though he's told them all these things, it's like we are sometimes. Well, it's not going to be that bad. You know, it just can't happen that way. It's not going to be real bad. Not realizing what they were facing, they were still arguing about such an insignificant thing as who was going to be greatest in the kingdom. Brenda.
Don't you think they had a real inflated view of their own self-importance?
I believe they did. Somebody did, didn't
They
they?
got that, you know, self-importance gets the rest of us many, many times.
That's right. Selfishness, I've told you all before, I'm sure, that our ages asked me one time years ago, what do you think the biggest problem is in the Lord's church? And I was a boy preacher at I think it was at Lipscomb at the time, maybe, might have still been at Freed Hardeman. And I really hadn't thought about it that much. But when I asked him what he thought it was, he said selfishness. He said, I really think that's the biggest problem that we face. And when you look at our world today, the narcissism, you know, where it's all about me, that is a real big problem in our world today. People can't seem to look beyond themselves. And you just get on the internet to do research or to check the weather or the news or whatever, and the headlines just blows your mind. How much of it is just pure narcissism? Just, you know, what's in this for me? It's all about me. I want this. I want that. And it's really just another word for selfishness. But we can have our egos inflated and think that we're a lot more important than we really are. I remember another Gar Tifus story that he told about this young preacher boy. He was a fireball preacher. He really waxing eloquent, you know, and just getting a lot of attention. And he was back at the door, and everybody that came by was just, I mean, just lathering him with all kinds of compliments and everything. And the story is, you could just sort of see him swelling up, you know, with his importance and thinking he was just so important. And there was this old gentleman came out, reached and shook his hand and said, "Right nice little talk, young man." And they said it just, you know, he just went down then. This old fella was not going to flatter him or anything, but sometimes preachers do that, and people in general do that. We have to guard against that. A very pertinent question. Well, let me back up a minute. Jesus washed the disciples' feet, not to institute a religious tradition or ritual. He washed their feet to address the very matter that we're talking about. It's in the context of their arguing about who is greatest, just preceding that Last Supper, that Jesus then, remember, takes that towel, girds himself, basin of water, and he begins to wash the feet of the disciples. This was the supreme act of humility, because this was an act that was reserved for the lowest person in the house. That was the person that was supposed to wash the feet of visitors. The homeowner usually didn't do it. It was a servant of his that did it. And I mean, that would, I don't mean to be grotesque, but do you remember running around barefoot in the yard where all the animals ran to, especially the chickens? And I've gone and fed the livestock at the barn in my bare feet. Most boys did where I grew up. And you think about that, and then somebody has to wash those feet. That would not be the most appealing thing and task in the world, would it? I can remember Mama telling me, "Young man, you wash your feet and wash them good before you get into bed." and that's as it should be. But that was a whole different place and time. They walked nearly everywhere they went. They did not wear socks and shoes as we wear. They usually wore sandals. And dry, barren, and dusty walkways. And, it would not have been a pleasant task to have washed someone's feet. But Jesus did that to teach the disciples a lesson about service and servitude. Jesus had earlier told the 12, you'll remember, that they would sit upon 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. That's just back in Matthew 19, verse 28. And this could be the very thing that had prompted the request for the places of highest honor. The place of highest honor was on the right hand. Second highest place was on the left hand. Now, it may have been assumed that James would be on the right hand, John on the left hand, if James was indeed the older of the two. So they sort of anticipated that. Josephus alludes to Jonathan sitting on the right hand of King Saul, and Abner, the commander of his army, sitting on the left hand. That would have indicated rank. Jonathan was his son, a good friend to David. A very pertinent question is then asked. Jesus asked them in verse 22, "Are you able to drink of the cup that I am about to drink?" In ancient times, people would sometimes be executed or Capital punishment would take the form of drinking a cup of poison. And that seems to be the illusion here. It's going to be a bitter and difficult cup to drink. But Jesus says, I am going to drink of that cup. Now, here's the question, James and John. Are you willing and able to drink of that cup? And both of them said what?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, we are able. We are able. Then Jesus told them, and those words indicate a lot of self-confidence. They felt pretty sure of themselves. Peter was a lot like that, wasn't he? Yeah, I'll die for you, Lord. I'll die with you. I'll never forsake you. I'll never leave you. I'll never deny you. And I'm sure that he spoke with great confidence in saying that. But as so often is the case, we underestimate the severity of the test that's about to come. And we have to be very careful about that. Sometimes we may need to be like those who said, help thou our unbelief. Because it's faith that gives us that confidence and courage. And sometimes our faith is not as strong as it ought to be. So they were devoted to him. They were confident that they could bear this. He predicted that they would indeed experience some of the very same things that he would experience. What happened to James?
Head was cut off.
Read Acts 12. He was the first apostle to be martyred for the faith. Now, Stephen was martyred, but he was not an apostle. So James' life and of service in the kingdom was cut very short, wasn't it? I doubt that his mother, his brother John, or anybody else imagined that such a thing would happen to him. But it did. Taken by Herod and killed. And that left John. Now, if John was the younger, you can imagine how he must have felt. I know what it's like to lose an older brother, as some of you no doubt do too. And you miss that older brother. But John had to carry on. He would not be killed, but he would suffer a lot of persecution. It's believed that he was exiled to Patmos and until Domitian died, and then he returned to Ephesus. I remember Brother Dowell Flatt making the point that on a clear day, John could, from the Isle of Patmos, see his home in Ephesus, see the homeland. And I believe Brother Dowell drew an analogy or used it as to make a point about when the book of Revelation says that there shall be no more sea. No more sea, S-E-A. John could look across that expanse of water and see his home, but he couldn't get there. That sea was what separated him from his home. And so the idea is that there's not going to be anything to separate us from God and from the joy that we will have in that beautiful place called heaven. But John is a great study, and he would suffer immensely for his faith and would later die a natural death. Now, as you continue reading, you'll notice that Jesus uses the Gentiles as a negative example. He said, I can't give you to sit on my right hand or my left. That's not mine to give. That shall be for whom it is prepared of my Father. He'll take care of this matter. And of course, we know that Jesus' teachings now show that there will be no big chiefs, little chiefs, and all of that stuff. He says, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. So they're oppressed by the dominion and the authority of those who are greater than they. And you can read the stories of Gentile leaders. You can talk about those of Greece and Rome and those nations before them, the Medes and the Persians. They all had their dictators and their leaders who made life very, very difficult. But Jesus is the ultimate peacemaker. He is the Prince of Peace. And he now tries to bring the disciples back together. They've been upset with one another, arguing back and forth. And so he begins to talk to them about the principles of greatness. And he emphasizes two that are a recurring theme in this book: humility and service. Those two things Jesus talks about perhaps as much as any other subjects that he taught on. You're going to have to serve, not be served. The purpose of his coming, he tells us, was not to be served, but to serve. He says, I came to give my life a ransom for many. Now, the word ransom in this passage refers to the price for freeing a slave, or the price for buying back a prisoner of war. The word's used in both those senses. And so that's the idea and the thrust of this passage. He came to give his life as a price, to free the slave, and to buy back the prisoner of war. Now here's a good question. To whom would the ransom be paid? Have you ever thought about that? It is God who has been offended by our sins, isn't it? So it would seem that the atonement was made for our sins, and the blood of Jesus went back to the holy place. He entered into the most holy place, not with the blood of bulls and goats, the Hebrews writer says, but with his own blood. So there's where the blood atonement comes in. Here's 3 quick lessons for us to remember and to learn from this section of Matthew 20, verses 20 through 28. Be careful what you ask for. You might get it. James and John didn't realize what was going to be involved in the request that they were making. Who would have been the very first two to have been killed if this had been in a physical kingdom and realm? Man on the right hand and on the left hand. Those would be the first two executed after the king. They may have even been executed before the king to make the king watch the executions. Family members were often killed. Second, the way up is down. If you want to become great in the kingdom, you've got to go down and become a servant of all. Third thing, in view of what Jesus said his purpose was in coming, there is no greater servant and friend than Jesus is. Remember R.W. Vincent's prayer? What a friend we have in him. That's very true, isn't it? I hope we'll appreciate this section of Scripture as well as all the others. And I appreciate your being here tonight and participating in the class.